Okay, so this video we're going to look at critical theories or critical perspective. And in the previous video, when I talked about the structural functionalist perspective, it's important to know that the structural functionalist perspective tends to gloss over inequalities within society. So inequalities based on social class, race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. Basically, it tends to ignore divisions that may generate considerable tension and conflict in society. The focus of the structural functionalist theories on stability at the expense of conflict and change, it gives the functionalist perspective a bit of a conservative character, according to other theories. So in response to that criticism, some sociologists have developed what is called as a critical perspective or the social conflict paradigm here. And just like the structural functionalists, these theories have an overarching kind of orientation to how they look at social life. And if we think about general starting questions, critical theories tend to ask questions like, well, who's benefiting from a social arrangement and who's not, on the other hand? To borrow the language of the structural functionalist theory, society is functional, but for who? And they kind of already know the answer in that it's not functional for everybody. So critical theories attempt to try and answer those sorts of questions and look at the division and inequality within society. So a major assumption of underlying the critical perspective is that society is largely a collection of competing groups who are struggling over a limited supply of resources and power within society. Each group has their own goals, their own agendas. Some have more power, more resources than others. There is therefore a continuous power struggle for control and access to scarce resources in society. And it's the idea of these theories is that social life and social experiences therefore emerge out of that conflict and out of that struggle. So with the critical perspective, the spotlight is put on conflict between more powerful groups and the more disadvantaged and unequal groups within society. So the first theorists that we see emerge in this perspective, really we're looking at this in terms of economic differences, so looking at rich versus poor. Later theorists also added to that race, so looking at, say, in a country and a society like Canada, looking at white people versus non-white individuals. Sorry for that noise there, if you heard that. Another sort of, conflict between groups would be conflict between the powerful would be conflict between men versus women. So looking at the difference that gender makes there. So I'm going to go back to, we used an example of the educational system when looking at structural functionalism. Let's come back to that here. And a critical theorist might be interested in looking at certain different things when it comes to looking at post-secondary education. So a functionalist, remember, sees the whole bunch of functional aspects of education. Would a critical theorist have something else to say about educational system? Of course. So they would look at and have looked at post-secondary education or education more broadly and noted how schooling and education perpetuates inequality by helping to reproduce the class structure within every new generation of people in a country. So for example, you look at the difference between university preparatory programs versus more vocational or trade programming and training. And that even starts kind of at the level of high school, in that more affluent and more, children from higher income families tend to be, not all and always, but they tend to be streamed more into the programs and the courses that will then set them up uh, for entrance into university later on, versus the poorer, lower income students. They tend to be streamed into the trades and more blue collar jobs in that regard, which sometimes don't pay as well as a job that you would need a bachelor's degree, for example, in. So as a result, those students, those kids coming from higher income families, they have, there's a pattern of them having access to better schooling, and with better schooling behind them, those young people leave university to pursue occupations that confer both prestige, higher prestige and status on them, but also potentially also higher income. So critical theories, one specific critical theory would be Marxism, or your textbook actually refers to this as historical materialism. But Karl Marx, regardless of what you call his theory, is kind of the grounding force in the critical perspective. And we'll come back to him, and you'll come back to him if you take any more sociology classes. Karl Marx is a theorist who stressed the importance of economic resources in social conflict. Marx saw a fundamental difference in industrialized capitalist societies that emerged out of that industrial revolution we talked about in another video. So Marx saw a fundamental division in industrialized capitalist societies between those who have the most economic resources, so those people who owned the factories, they owned the capital and the means to make money, and Marx called those individuals, those groups of people, the bourgeoisie. And so he saw a difference between them, a division between them and those who were workers within the factories. They sold their labor power for a wage, and they worked under the conditions set by the owners of the factory, or the bourgeoisie. And that group, the workers, Marx called the proletariat. And Marx noted that in this system that was set up with this emergence of the industrial capitalism, not all members of society are benefiting from this. Really, only the bourgeoisie benefited, because with machines and more people to work in their factories to produce goods that they could then sell, they could make a profit. The faster, the quicker, the bigger they were. The proletariat, the workers, not so much. Often their wages did not go up, the more profit their employer made. So the modern day incarnation, I guess, of the capitalist, bourgeoisie and proletariat would be, the modern day manifestation of the capitalist, and particularly the bourgeoisie, would be multinational corporations, and like the CEOs, the chief executive officer, and the head and the owner of multinational corporations or businesses, that organizations still exist within society today. Now, many sociologists who embrace the critical perspective who embrace the critical perspective attempt not just to understand society, but they actually also have that very activist goal, because they also want to reduce that inequality and eliminate it, and they want to reduce the division between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the rich and the poor. They want to eliminate that inequality. This definitely was Karl Marx's goal. He was a bit of an activist, or a lot of an activist. For example, in one of his writings, he made this point that's on the screen here. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Conflict perspective, critical perspective, as we're looking at it, really focuses on this concept of conflict. And critical theorists don't necessarily see conflict as a completely destructive force. What it does, when you sort of note that there's conflict between two groups within society, like rich versus poor, men versus women, what that does is it focuses attention on the social problems, and it brings people together to try and solve those problems. So conflict is seen as a way to, in a vehicle of positive social change. Marx argued that the workers in society, the proletariat, would come together and recognize their shared exploitation. A sort of, class consciousness would arise, and the workers would begin to see themselves as a group, and what would result would be a socialist revolution. According to Marxist predictions, the workers would band together and attempt to overthrow the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, and the workers would then attempt to gain control over the resources in society. They then would attempt to restructure society so that everyone was equal. No person or group of people would have more wealth or more things than any other group. And so this was Marx's, the basis of all of his writing. And we still kind of use and refer to his points. And you may recently have been have been hearing people accusing certain individuals. I'm thinking specifically, actually, there's a new mayor of the city of New York in the US, and during the campaign, and still now, he's accused of being a socialist or a communist, and socialism and communism actually are concepts articulated by Karl Marx, because he, in this vision of a socialist revolution, he argued that societies would start out as capitalist societies, but because those are unequal and unfair, there would be a revolution. And what he argued is that initially societies would transform to be a communist type of society, and then eventually transition into a completely kind of egalitarian society, which he called socialism. So people using those terms today are using them wrong in very, very clear ways, but this is the origin of it here. So conflict, and we have seen in actual sort of revolutions, we've seen those revolutions and really important, significant changes, social changes happening as being rooted in the conflict between different groups of people. So conflict was central to the women's movement. For example, of the 1970s and the civil rights movement in the United States as well. Those are, movements that the critical perspectives help us to explain and understand. Again, more recently, we're kind of in what some people kind of call late stage capitalism, which is sort of, if we went back to and read Karl Marx's work, we're now on the cusp potentially in Western, North American society, maybe on the cusp of a socialist revolution. And what's on the screen here are just some screenshots from Reddit, or from, I don't even know what website anymore, some just sort of posts on different types of social media that Karl Marx would definitely step in and say, yeah, this is the proletariat, the workers, really calling out the inequality of our current economic system and the current working system. And there's nothing else wants to do but eliminate and get rid of and move on from capitalism into a more equitable society. These are expressions of frustration. You can see in these posts here expressions of frustration of, the average kind of worker in these. I'm going to assume these are all from the U.S. In that regard there.